When she was 12 years old, Alison Wearing's father broke what was then a cardinal taboo. He became an out-of-the-closet gay father. She details her father's story in her book, Confessions of a Fairy's Daughter, growing up with a gay dad. And she joins us now here in the studio. Nice to meet you.
Likewise.
I'm just wondering what your old man thought when you told him, I'm going to write a book, and it's all about your coming out, and I'm going to call you a fairy in the title. So let's hear it.
Well, it didn't start out as a book. It started out as an essay, and I sent him, and the title came first for me. That was the very first thing. I was working on another project, and I kept having these, I was dredging up memories for this other project, and I kept coming up with these memories of my childhood, and they were, for the most part, really fun and quite easy to document. And so I gathered them all and collected them and just put them to one side. I just thought it was a long essay. And he wrote to me, I was living in Mexico, and he wrote to me saying, I've just written a biography of my father. Would you like to read it? His dad was a county court judge from London. And so I said, isn't that funny? I've just written a biography of my father, and it's called Confessions of a Fairy's Daughter. Would you like to read it? And he was interested.
Did he have a reaction to that title?
No.
He didn't have a problem with that?
No. You know, for us, that was always a term of endearment. It was never an insult. And I think it was a term of an era. It really wasn't necessary. It was a term also that the gay community then owned. You know? So I never saw it as anything insulting, and neither did he. He thought it was fun.
Okay.
And I loved that there was a bit of ambiguity there.
Mm-hmm. There's, you know, obviously you could have taken any number of different approaches to telling the story. You could have told the story of men in general who came out of the closet at that time. It was a controversial time to do so. But you have taken a very personal approach, and there's a lot of family history in this book that is deeply personal. Mm-hmm. Why'd you choose that way?
I don't know that I chose it. It probably chose me, because I was first just documenting memory for another purpose. I didn't have a book in mind. I didn't decide I'm going to write a book about growing up with a gay father, and it's going to take this tack. Or it really was, so often these things are so organic, no? They start as one thing and then they become something else. It's a bit of a magic trick. It's beautiful to be part of.
And your dad gave you carte blanche, right? He basically said, go ahead, tell the story, do what you want.
He did.
How about your mom?
My mom read, the essay that I mentioned became the script of a one-woman show. My mom's never seen the show, but she has read the script, and she liked it. And she's a very forgiving person. So I think she, like my father, they first were looking at it as a piece of literature, a piece of theater, and then as a story that was about them. But really they saw it as a work of art first.
Tell us about the box.
Yeah.
It starts with the box in many respects.
Mm-hmm. Midway through the writing, I'd written 150 pages. At that point, I knew I was writing a book. I'd written an essay. It turned into the script of a one-woman show that I'd performed for about a year. And then I decided to open it into a book. And I wrote about 150 pages, which were all stories from my perspective, the way I saw it. And I felt finished, although it didn't feel finished as a book. But my story felt done. So I wasn't sure, do I delve into the backdrop of the gay revolution that was happening at the time that my father came out? Because he came out at a really interesting time when really Toronto or Canada was coming out. And so I thought maybe that's the direction I would go. And I called my father and said, could I come into Toronto and ask you a few questions? I also realized that I didn't know much about him as a young adult. I'd never really heard. When was he grappling with that then, even, you know, very privately, or was it something that happened when he was 40? So I came to Toronto and we had tea and I asked him a few questions. And then I said, is there anything that you would want to add? Is there anything that you feel is important? And he looked kind of pensive and said, well, I think that you should read this novel, and I think it would be important to read some of the magazines and things of the time. And then he disappeared into his basement, and he came up with this box. And he said, you might want to look through this. And then just casually started to make dinner. And so I said, oh, what's this? It's just a few papers, and I realized what it was the moment I opened it up. It was that writer's dream. It was letters, journals, clippings, drafts of letters that he was writing to people, letters that he'd received, this jumble of gold
Treasure
for a
trove.
writer. Yeah. That's
What was the
exactly
first thing
what
you read?
It was a journal entry. I pulled out this loose leaf paper, and it was a journal entry with a date, and the first line said, "Last night I made it with a Roman Catholic priest."
And you thought, Dorothy, we're not in Kansas anymore. Or Toto, excuse me, Toto.
We'd left Kansas
Yeah,
a long
that's
time
true.
before.
That's
so
true.
we'd been in Munchkin land for a long, long time. But what was interesting was my father's reaction. Had it been me, I might have torn the paper from my child's hand. But he just laughed and said, "Oh, I remember him. Oh, he was so cute."
Well, I only say what I say because the fact is, regardless of the sexual orientation of your parents, no child wants to have too much information about their parents' sex lives, right?
Yeah.
So, in retrospect, let's take you back to Peterborough. You're a kid growing up. None of us thinks much about our parents' sex lives, hetero or homosexual. Did any thoughts of your father's sexual orientation ever enter your mind as you're growing up?
Never.
Never. You never.
There wasn't such a thing as questioning your parents' sexual orientation in Peterborough in 1970.
Right.
No. We didn't even have the vocabulary to do that. My dad was different from other fathers, but frankly, he was more fun. That's what I thought.
Different because he liked show tunes more than everybody else.
Yeah, and he loved to go shopping and bake croissant and sing with us, and he was more fun. That, if there was any distinction, that's how I named it.
I kind of like the story, actually, of how he got you out of the bathtub. Do you remember what you had to do?
I had to recite. My brother and I would take the bath together. We were young, very young, and he would have us recite the names of the prime ministers. And the one that could do it the fastest got to stay in a little bit longer. And so
you can go 1 through 22?
McDonald, Mackenzie, McDonald, Abbott, Tupper, Borden. No, Abbott, Tupper, Bowell.
Bowell, yeah. Oh, you're out of the bath first.
No, Abbott, Thompson. I was always out of the bath first. Abbott, Thompson, Bowell, Tupper, Laurier, Borden, me and King, Bennett, King, Saint Laurent, Pearson, Diefenbaker, Pearson, Trudeau. See, that's why I always had to get up first.
Hey, history didn't stop at Trudeau. Well, I guess it did at this time. Okay, I get you. Not bad. And you also knew that the McDonald coming back and the King coming back. Very good.
Yeah.
That's not bad.
Although for me, it was just a string of syllables. It had no meaning at all.
Did you ever, now he, of course, he's written a pretty good history of the Liberal Party at that time.
Yeah.
And knew Trudeau. Did you ever get to recite that list to Trudeau?
I did, in fact.
You did?
Yeah.
And?
He was amused.
I'll bet he was. Okay, let's actually hit the nail on the head here. The moment you found out your father didn't just like shopping and didn't just like show tunes, but actually was a gay man. Take us through that moment. How'd you find out?
I was 12 years old, and I was the following day getting on a plane and going to Germany for 6 weeks for a gymnastics exchange. And I wanted to know if my dad was going to be at the airport to meet me or to see me off, because he wasn't spending that much time at home. And he had this apartment in Toronto, which we were told was for research. He had to do research for his book on the Liberal Party.
So your family's living in Peterborough
Yeah.
all the time, and he's there some of the time,
Yeah,
but has this place in Toronto.
Yeah, he probably was half and half, or I don't recall. No. But clearly I missed him, and clearly it was important for me that he be there. So I asked my mother, and I think I was pestering her a bit with questions like, why does he have to have an apartment in Toronto, and why doesn't he live with us very much anymore, and is he going to be there to see me off? And she said, well, there are a lot of things about your father that you don't know. And I said, like what? And she was unloading the dishwasher, I remember. And there was this prolonged moment where the cutlery was coming out of the cutlery basket, one utensil at a time. And I could just feel that the roof was about to cave in, but I didn't know why. And she said, remember that time you came back from Toronto and told me that Dad had taken you to a gay bar? And then I started to cry. I didn't know why, though. He hadn't taken me to a gay bar, first off. He'd taken me to a restaurant, and someone in the restaurant, it was sort of a gay meeting place, someone in the restaurant had probably made a joke about, oh, you've brought your daughter to a gay bar, and I parroted that back to my mother, having no idea what that meant. It didn't mean anything to me. Otherwise, I wouldn't have relayed it, no, to my mother, of all people. But I knew it was bad news. That's all I knew. And I knew that it was the worst thing you could be, because that was the worst thing you could say to anyone on the playground. And suddenly, my dad was the worst thing that anyone could be. And how could that be possible? He was the best thing that I knew. And so I couldn't reconcile. Really, for me, the moment was more of confusion than anything, because there wasn't the context that there is now. We have a context for that word, for that happening in people's lives. But in the 1970s in Peterborough, in the 1980s in Peterborough, no, we didn't even have the word.
Did you, when you finally processed this, hate him?
No.
Never angry at him?
I was angry at him because that's part of the process of mourning the loss of someone, and I was losing him from my family life, from my home. But I wasn't angry at him for being gay. I was angry, I remember feeling that this was somehow kind of selfish. Like, why do you need to do this? Why don't you do this later when I'm 18 or something? Or why now? No, why? What's so wrong with what we have? We're actually really happy and we have a lot of fun. And why do you want to live in an apartment in Toronto when you can live in our great house in Peterborough with all those gardens you spent years fluffing up? No? Why do that? It was impossible to understand. So there is an element, there's anger in that, but it wasn't really at him as a person, and certainly not because he was gay.
Okay, I understand. But was there, at some point in all of this revelation, any thinking that I wish he weren't?
Oh, yeah.
You did wish that?
Yeah, sure. I wanted to be normal, just like everyone else. And I wanted to just fix this. I just didn't understand why this had to happen. But I remember in reading that box, one of the things that I found really, I don't know whether it was touching, but surprised me, I think, was in reading that he himself longed for some kind of straight pill. He said if there had been such a thing, he would have swallowed the whole bottle. You know, to not have to do what he was going to have to do to the people he loved. But there was no straight pill. There was no way around doing this. This was part of what needed to happen in order for him to be who he was.
You've told us how you found out. How did your mother find out?
She found a letter that he had written to a lover.
So she didn't even find out from him. He
No.
didn't tell her.
No.
She happened upon it.
Yeah, which is it's a brutal way
bad
to
way to
find
find
out.
out.
And I might be angry about that, but I also I really sympathize with my father because at that time he really felt that conversation might be the last he would ever have with her, and maybe the last time that he would ever see his children. And the legal system would have supported her in that decision had she decided to go that route. So it was a terrifying conversation to have. So I can fully imagine thinking, maybe tomorrow, or maybe next week, or not quite ever finding the right moment, or always finding a reason to just postpone this agony a little bit longer.
Mind you, in the midst of all of this agony, you tell a story which is actually quite adorable and quite funny. As you are comparing notes with one of your schoolmates as to who's got a worse father, your friend said you had something else to deal with.
Yeah, I confessed to her finally. I hadn't told anyone. And it really is like trying to contain water that keeps filling and filling and filling. At some point, you just burst. You have to tell someone. Or you find another coping mechanism, which maybe isn't so healthy. But I had to tell someone. And so finally I told her. And she was very funny about it. And then said, well, you think that's bad. My dad's been having an affair for the last 12 years, and he actually has a child with someone that we're not supposed to know about. And then we both lay there thinking, wow, whose life is worse? Right. Well, that was a really tricky one to figure out, and it instantly made me feel better. It's a bit like,
Little Schadenfreude.
yeah, yeah.
But on the other hand, she really didn't like her dad for the secret life he was leading. But you seem to have, you seem to come around and accept your dad for what he was.
Yeah, and you gave the key right there in your question, because his was a secret life and mine wasn't. And I don't think we really, I think we underestimate the toxicity of secrecy. And that honesty really does free us all. The truth really does free everyone, as painful as it is. And it is very painful, but growth is painful. And
I want to read a little excerpt of your book, if I can, here.
Sure.
Here we go. In my quietest moments, you write, I began to believe that there had to exist, far, far away, a place where none of this would matter, where I wouldn't have to lie or pretend, where I could walk out the door, wave to neighbors, and feel like I belonged. Though I'm sure I didn't put the feeling into words at the time, it was more of a churning, a queasiness I ached to resolve. The way a seasick person longs for land, scans the horizon for it constantly, dreams of it, the sensations of stillness beneath her feet. Yet the only thing visible in every direction is water, waves everywhere. Now, I guess there was a kind of irony, because as your father was coming out of the closet, you were kind of going into the closet in your own way. Describe that, if you would.
there was no place for the truth about my family in my life. The hardest part about having a gay father when I did, my dad coming out, was not that he came out. It was that it was unacceptable that he was coming out. That was what was difficult. That was actually the real torture. And because living in the closet it's a very poisonous existence. I don't know that people realize just how much anxiety is bound up in keeping the truth about yourself a secret. It's like living with a monster or something that's inside you, longing to get out. And that's what it was like for me. I just felt like I had this secret churning in me constantly. And people would ask me questions that I had to come up with answers for. And so I would just invent things on the spot about why he lived with a man, why he was in Toronto, why he spoke like that, why he dressed like that. My life in theater began then. I just had to invent on the spot and be convincing, because I couldn't face in high school in Peterborough in the 1970s, 80s, I couldn't face what that truth coming out, what that would have meant. It would have meant a metal bar to the knees socially. So I went in. I became the one in the closet, and I led a double life. I had Peterborough, where I was a normal Peterborough girl as much as I could be, and then I would go to Toronto and spend the weekend with my dad and his boyfriend and their friends, and going to ballet and going to My Beautiful Laundrette and things like that. And then coming back on the bus, I would invent what am I going to tell people about what really happened. And people in the closet live that way. They live with this secret. So in a sense, I was in the closet, although I'm not gay, so I didn't have to come out in that sense. But I did have to come into the truth of who I am, because part of who I am is that I have a gay dad.
Another excerpt. The thing about having a gay parent is that so long as the rest of society can get over it, the gay part isn't nearly as important as the parent part. In fact, it's incidental. Constancy of love, truthfulness of heart, and joyfulness of life count infinitely more than who is doing what with which gender in the bedroom. Being in the presence of love is being in the presence of love. Ultimately, it is the only thing that truly matters. That's really well said. Did your dad ever wonder whether he could be true to himself and a good father to his kids at the same time?
Yes, because there were no models at the time. So that was a question. Because gay life, he was kind of stuck between worlds in a sense. There wasn't a place for him to be a gay man in Peterborough, in where we lived and so on, in our neighborhood. And yet there wasn't really a place at that time for children in the gay world in Toronto. It was mostly because it had to be so much of it was underground or partially hidden, or it had that element to it. There wasn't really a place to bring kids. No, most of it happened in bars and baths, and there wasn't the open gay culture that you have now, where you can go down to Second Cup and there's a gay couple with their child. I mean, there weren't those opportunities. So how does he reconcile these two worlds that don't seem to have any meeting place at all? It was a question for him, a huge question. I would say, one of the biggest questions was, how does he manage these two parts of his life? And he read an article in the Globe and Mail, which was really pivotal for him, about a man named Michael Lynch, who was also a professor, and he was a gay dad. And he was the first, I think, openly gay dad who came out in the media saying, I'm a father and I'm gay, and those two things are not mutually exclusive. On the contrary, I'm a great dad, and I love being a father. And that, he was very instrumental in my dad coming out. In fact, Michael Lynch was the very first person. My dad sought him out, and he was the very first person he uttered the phrase to, I think I might be gay.
He was a fine arts prof at York? Is that the guy?
That was a different guy.
Well, that was a different guy.
Michael Lynch was a prof at U of T. I don't know what he taught.
Okay. Unless I missed it, I don't think there's much in the book about your siblings' reaction to all of this. And I know there was a variety of reactions in your family. I mean, your mother eventually came around and made her peace with it. But your dad's sister never spoke to him again.
No, she's still alive.
And she still hasn't spoken to him. And your dad's 75 now. So this is many years going, this is decades now, and they haven't spoken, which is a tragedy. How about your siblings? Do you want to talk about that? Or?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll
Did I
talk
miss
about
it?
anything.
Is it in the book? No, did I miss it?
Do you know? I mention them. I don't know that I go into it was tricky. It's tricky writing about other people's relationships with other people.
Sure.
No? I felt there were certain boundaries and that I had to honor as a writer, drawing their living family members into a book. So the easiest way of saying it is there was never really a blip in my brother's relationship with my father, although you would assume that it was more difficult because they were boys, because my older brother was 14 when he found out. But he and my dad, all three of us, we had such a close relationship with my father all the way along. And when he came out, he blew that closet door right off its hinges, because he was so transparent and forthcoming about everything, and so accepting of himself, and so enthusiastic about finally being who he was. That was very contagious for all of us. When someone is feeling ashamed of themselves or feeling, I think, ambivalent, it makes it trickier for the other person. But if they are in full acceptance of who they are and very open about what's happening and allows any question to be put to them, it makes it so much easier for kids. They can feel that, and they feel relaxed in that environment. And so we all, I don't want to whitewash the situation. There were difficult moments, and we were teenagers, so there was rebellion, and there were tensions sometimes, and we were, angry about certain things at different times. But that probably all was within the boundaries of what's normal with adolescents and their parents. Having my father's sexual orientation come into the picture added a dimension. It certainly made it more complex, but it didn't affect our relationship heart to heart with our father.
That's interesting because I'm thinking the central Ontario of the 1970s, and if you're a teenage boy going to school at that time, there's plenty of homophobia and gay bashing and that kind of thing going on in the schoolyard. And then suddenly it's not just an academic exercise anymore. This is my dad.
Yeah.
And yet your brothers somehow cope with all that.
I think we all separated our lives. We compartmentalized our lives. We had our Peterborough life and we had our Toronto life. And boys, they don't ask as many questions as girls. No? They just want to, they play and they'll grunt. They were also in that Neanderthal phase of male adolescence. Yeah. So there wasn't a lot of the same sort of questions that girls have.
Sure.
And girls will ask and ask and ask and ask.
Boys will say, throw me the football and let's go. Yeah,
sort of, and they weren't quite as interested in the details. And so I think my brothers didn't fabricate to the extent that I did, which was more honorable, I'd say. But I think they just changed the subject a lot. They just didn't bring it up. And because my father by that point really had moved to Toronto and was coming to Peterborough just to teach, and then he would go back home, they didn't have to. He wasn't a presence in their life. He didn't live next to the high school, let's say. That might have been more difficult if he'd been sweeping in and out of the school in silk shirts, yeah, that might have presented a little bit more, a bit more awkwardness for my brothers.
I got 20 seconds left to ask you this. Does anybody ever tease you by saying, I wonder if what happened to your mom's going to happen to you? You've got a significant other in your life who is male, and you have a child, and do you ever think about history repeating?
No. I was once at a party where a gay man fell in love with my he found my partner attractive, my male partner attractive, and said, I certainly hope history might repeat itself and I might benefit.
Now that'd be a book. Okay. But you've done a fine job with the first one.
Thank you so much.
Which is actually your second one. I got to tell you, Alison, I really enjoyed it, and it's a touching, lovely, wonderful story. Confessions of a Fairy's Daughter, growing up with a gay dad. Alison Wearing, thanks a lot for coming into TVO tonight.
Thank you so much.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.